I wanted to make this video a how-to guide for painting realistic hair in watercolor because over the past weeks, I spent some time working on that. I made mistakes, I failed, I started over several times, I made adjustments, and in the course of all of that, I identified no less than 21 tips that helped me paint this piece. I compiled everything into this step-by-step video, and I'm sure there will be things that can help someone else step up their painting game, so if that's what you're looking for, keep on watching. You'll find tons of value in this video, especially because I'm breaking it down through a beginner's eyes by writing everything down as I progress with the medium myself, and I find that most times, tutorials overlook simple yet essential tips and things to be aware of or do that are really going to help a beginner get past difficulties and make progress at watercolor. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome to my channel. I segmented my 21 tips into 4 main stages, and I'll be illustrating them and also showing you the speed painting for this piece as I go through the tips. Stage 1 is all about how to prepare for the painting by picking the right supplies and paints rather than just start painting unprepared. My first tip for this is to take a good look at your reference and identify how many shade variations you see between the darkest and lightest parts. If you don't have a reference, I'd suggest to find one that you can use as a guide for this tip. For me, I see dark brown as my main color in the reference I used for this, but it's not everywhere the same. I see 4 shade variations of this brown color, a very light shade, one a bit darker, one even darker, and lastly, a really dark shade. So now I know I should probably work with 4 washes of paint, to which I'll add more or less water in order to match the intensity of the shade variations I spotted in my reference. The number of washes also determines the number of layers I'm going to apply. So here I'm planning on 4 layers. The first one will be the lightest wash and the last one will be the darkest wash. I'd say that roughly 3 to 5 washes should do for any watercolor hair painting. At least 3 for good contrast, but no more than 5, otherwise you may end up feeling distracted and finding it hard to get your contrast on point through way too many layers. One thing I do after I make my washes is to swatch them just to make sure they look increasingly darker, just like what I'm demonstrating here. Tip number 2 is to try and keep your color scheme as simple as possible and avoid mixing too many colors or using washes of different shades. Having too many colors to mix may not help if you run out of your washes and need to make new ones and having to find the right mixing ratio again. And on the other hand, using washes that don't come from the same shade will complicate things even more and the hair won't look natural. What I mean by that is, unless you're looking at someone with a fancy and elaborate hair color, most people's natural hair is mostly one shade that appears more or less dark depending on the lighting. This is the goal with my watercolor technique, finding the shade you want, for me here a dark brown, and adding more or less water to it to make a really saturated wash, a really light one, and some washes in between. Tip number 3 is to experiment with your paints to recreate the hair shade you see in your reference picture and prepare a few washes of it. If you don't have a reference, at least figure out what color you want to use and get the paint ready. For this painting, for instance, I used a mixture of burnt sienna, sepia, Payne's Gray plus a bit of black, and by the way, I'll link my paints along with everything else I'm using in the description below. When it comes to finding the right shade, you may wonder, how did I come up with this color scheme? I used an app and a technique that I already detailed in the video popping up here, if you want to check it out next. I'll link it again at the end of this video and in the description if you're interested in learning how to find the right mixes to achieve a very specific shade. Now that picking the right shade matter is out of the way, we need to focus on the other supplies you'll be using for best results. Tip number 4 is to pick not the best brush, but your best brush for this watercolor hair painting. There are paintbrushes out there that are great for painting fine lines, like the one I own here, the Silver Black Velvet Round Brush size 8. Before I got it, I practiced hair with what I had available to me, and it worked because I did have a few paintbrushes that get to a fine tip and remain that way while painting. I'm thinking of my Raphael natural hair fiber paintbrushes, for instance. What I'd recommend you to do is to test out all of your paintbrushes if you need to determine which one will get you the prettiest and finest strokes for hair. Unless all you own are flat paintbrushes or really big ones, you should be fine and not have to invest into a specific paintbrush. If you need to or just want to get a new paintbrush that's great for details, I'd recommend to try those silver velvet round brushes. Again, you'll find the link in the description. Tip number 5 is to pick the right paper. This one is going to be easier than you think because I tried the most common ones, both cold pressed and hot pressed paper, for hair painting, and both work great. I personally usually dislike hot pressed paper for the rest of my project because I find it handles water poorly, which brought me to the conclusion that hair painting allows a lot of flexibility when it comes to paper. I can see why. It's probably because for hair painting we're using very little water and tracing thin lines all the way through, which makes it hard to see problems happening such as blooms or other unwanted marks and excessive water would create in most watercolor projects. I used the Arches hot pressed paper here, but I'm confident that other less expensive brands will work just fine for the reason I just gave you. Less water, much less limitations when it comes to watercolor paper. For me, this is a big plus of painting hairstyles in watercolor. It's also a pretty repetitive exercise. So once you get the process, how to trace nice strokes, once you figure out your colors and know how to get your contrast looking good, you can easily replicate this kind of project and improve on it with basic watercolor supplies. Tip number 6 is to practice one lock of hair on a separate sheet of paper, mainly to practice the strokes, the layering process, contrast, to see how your washes turn out once dry, and generally to avoid disappointment and having to start a whole piece over and waste supplies. I did this here, for instance. I experimented with different techniques, paintbrushes, colors, and when I was ready to go, I felt a lot more confident that I could pull off this project. We're getting into the second stage of the painting, and it's the sketching part. Tip number 7 is to outline the hairstyles first, then draw main locks. The key here is to focus on the bigger picture, not the tiny details. Tip number 8, and I quickly found out at my expense, is to press enough with a pencil that your sketching lines remain visible throughout the first layers. If the lines are really light, they will fade with the very first layer, and all the work you did on the sketch goes to waste. Painting within the outline alone gets really confusing really fast. I tried it and it was a mess. These locks really help focus on small parts of the hair and keep contrast in sight. Tip number 9 is to take off odd parts of the reference, if you're using one and if it's just the hair you're drawing, like I did here, so the overall look of the piece looks balanced. Doing this also is a way to simplify the locks and the work as a whole. Now all this is set, we're off to a great start to begin painting. This is stage 3 of my process, the painting technique to paint realistic hair in watercolor. Of course, this is just my way of doing it, what I came up with and what works for me for this style of watercolor, so feel free to take away only what you need. Tip number 10 is to paint from top to bottom and left to right if you're right-handed, for instance. This may seem like an evidence, but who hasn't ever smudged their watercolor when they were first getting started? One thing I noticed, by the way, is that with hot pressed paper and the very thin strokes we're making for hair, things will dry really fast, and I find it all the more enjoyable to paint hair, very relaxing and easygoing overall. Tip number 11 is to make your first layer with a solid base of your lightest wash, not lines yet, since most of this first layer will get covered up anyway, so why bother getting too much detail there? There's really no need for it here, unless you want to preserve the white of the paper in places if white is your lightest color. I've never tried that. For my first layer, I proceed wet on dry, only my brush is wet and loaded with paint, and I apply the paint directly on the dry surface. You can also do it wet on wet, but personally I find I'm able to maintain a clean outline for the hairstyle with wet on dry since there is a lot more control of the paint. On hot press you will most likely see nasty stains forming and start and stop points showing because things dry so fast, but it's totally fine since, like I said, we're going to color up so much of it you won't even know the difference later on. So don't worry if the first layer looks awful. Tip number 12 of the painting technique is to let every single layer dry completely before moving on to the next one. If not, your clean hair strokes will turn into a hot blurry mess and we will lose the realistic look and the definition of the hair in general. Tip number 13 is to use the wet on dry technique when you start making these fine lines that stand for the hair. This tip links to the previous one in the sense that the paper must be dry when painting the hair. The only exception I see to this is if you were to go for a loose hairstyle, then it wouldn't really matter if the paper was wet. Tip number 14 is to paint in the direction the hair goes. Start on the top of the hairlock and move down towards the middle of the strand. Do the same from the bottom of the strand, moving towards the middle again. Mimicking the hair direction really helps with it looking more realistic and preserving the highlights. Tip number 15 is to leave some parts of the previous wash visible with each layer to build up contrast effectively. For instance, once your first solid layer is dry, start on the second one by tracing hair everywhere, but on the very lightest parts you can spot on your reference. With the third and fourth and maybe fifth layer, repeat and make sure to only work on the areas your layer is for and to keep those highlights and the color gradient visible until the end. This is the process I use for painting hair realistically, but there are ways to amplify your technique for better results. This is what I'll call stage 4 of my tutorial, extra tips to make the most of your paintings. Tip number 16 is to trace the hairlines in chunks by overlapping them thickly on top of each other, rather than creating stripes that wouldn't look so natural. You can clearly see the difference here. The chunks will get thicker as you layer, so don't be alarmed if the hair looks scarce and bland in the early stages of the painting. Tip number 17 is to keep your strokes loose, not stiff, and relax your hand as much as possible. Since hair don't look stiff in the first place, it will help with achieving realism to keep this detail in mind and mimic it through the way you paint. Practice on a scrap piece of paper and it will come as you get more comfortable. Tip number 18 is to work with a brush that's wet enough to produce nice steady lines. When the paint you dip your brush in is a bit too dry, this may be the case with the last and most saturated wash. It will be hard to make clean and smooth lines. Just add a little bit of water if that happens. Tip number 19 is to be patient and wait for the last layer to reveal the beauty of your painting. I find that first layers don't often look too good with watercolors, and I know how easy it is to feel like giving up. If you ever have experienced this, it's totally normal, just keep going because the last layers are the ones that bring everything together. But until you experience it for yourself, it can be hard to be persistent, so don't give up. Like I said at the beginning, I'm often having to start over or experiment, but the reward is great, so it's really worth it to be persistent. Tip number 20 is to take a step back, observe the reference and the painting, and assess if contrast looks good enough or if it needs more work. There are always small things you can improve, but overall, if the hair looks a little bland, all you need to do is to adjust contrast by adding a bit of a darker color to your last wash to accent the shadows. For instance, in my painting, I added black to my last wash to make it a bit darker, and I reworked the areas I felt weren't dark enough. Tip number 21 is to trace loose hair here and there. I love this step because it's fun and it really makes the hair look great. In my painting, I added some throughout the process because I wanted some to look light, like they were farther back or thinner, and others to look darker, but you can keep this as a very last step if you prefer. Make sure to use the previous tip of keeping it loose and relaxed to produce beautiful natural curves in these hair. Start anywhere on the mane you have created and make hair of different lengths, curves, and directions. And even if not a lot of loose hair is visible in the reference, don't be afraid to add some. If you enjoyed this tutorial, check these ones out and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to see more of this portrait series. See you in the next video!